The gentle hum of jet engines filled the air at Atlanta International Airport as Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson adjusted his military cap in the terminal's reflection. His crisp uniform bore the weight of countless memories from his third tour of duty, each medal telling a story of sacrifice and courage. The year was 1968, and while the world was changing, some things back home remained stubbornly the same. Michael checked his ticket one more time, running his finger across the words, "First Class." It was a special gift from his commanding officer, Colonel Richards, who had insisted on upgrading his flight home. "You've earned this and more," the colonel had said, pressing the ticket into his hands with a firm handshake. The memory brought a slight smile to Michael's tired face. As he waited at the gate, an elderly couple caught his eye. The husband, wearing a veteran's cap from World War II, gave him a respectful nod. It was a small gesture that spoke volumes, the universal language of those who had served. Michael returned the nod, feeling a momentary connection with someone who understood what it meant to wear the uniform. The boarding call crackled over the speakers, and Michael gathered his small carry-on bag. He had learned to travel light over the years, carrying only what he needed. His mother's photo, tucked safely in his breast pocket, was his most precious possession. He could almost hear her voice saying, "Stand tall, baby. You're representing not just yourself, but all of us." Walking through the terminal, Michael noticed the mixed reactions his presence drew. Some people smiled warmly, others averted their eyes, and a few stared a bit too long. He had grown accustomed to this dance of expressions, this silent commentary on a black man in uniform. But today felt different. He was heading home, and that thought alone lifted his spirits. The line moved slowly as passengers showed their boarding passes. A young boy, no more than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed at Michael's medals. "Mom, look, he's a hero." The mother, looking somewhat embarrassed, quickly shushed her son, but Michael smiled and gave the boy a friendly wave. The child's innocent admiration was a reminder of why he served, to make a better world for the next generation. As he approached the gate, the flight attendant checking tickets greeted him with genuine warmth. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she said, her eyes crinkling with a sincere smile. It was refreshing, this moment of simple human kindness. Michael thanked her quietly, his natural humility showing through. The jet bridge stretched before him like a path to another world. With each step, Michael felt the weight of his upcoming transition. From the structured military life to civilian world, from war zones to American streets, from being a sergeant to just being a black man in 1968 America. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Keep your head up, son. Your dignity is your armor." The plane's interior welcomed him with cool air and the subtle scent of leather and coffee. First class, it was something he walked past many times but never experienced. The seats were wider, the lighting softer, the atmosphere more refined. Michael paused for a moment, taking it all in, allowing himself to feel proud of this small victory. As he prepared to take his assigned seat, 2A, Michael thought about home. His little sister would be waiting at the airport in San Francisco, probably with that huge welcome sign she had promised to make. The thought of her face, beaming with pride, gave him strength. Whatever this flight might bring, he was ready. He was a soldier, after all, and more importantly, he was his parents' son, taught to face any challenge with grace and dignity. Little did he know, as he stood there in the first-class cabin, that this flight would become more than just a journey home. It would become a moment that would test not just his patience, but the conscience of everyone around him. The other passengers began filing onto the plane, creating that familiar shuffle of people finding their seats and storing their bags. Michael stood patiently in the aisle, waiting for an elderly gentleman to place his bag in the overhead compartment. He offered to help, easily lifting the heavy suitcase and securing it safely above. "First time in first class," the flight attendant asked warmly as she guided him to his seat. Her name tag read Linda, and her smile seemed genuine. Michael nodded, feeling a mix of pride and slight nervousness. "Well, you're in for a treat," she said, gesturing to seat 2A by the window. "We'll be serving dinner shortly after takeoff, and you'll have your choice of chicken or beef." The leather seat felt soft and spacious, nothing like the cramped military transport planes he'd gotten used to. Michael carefully placed his carry-on under the seat in front of him, making sure it was properly tucked away. His uniform was still crisp despite the long day of travel, and he took pride in maintaining its appearance. A businessman across the aisle gave him a respectful nod. "Which branch?" he asked, noticing Michael's uniform. "Army, sir," Michael replied politely. "3 tours." The man whistled softly, impressed. "My son's thinking about enlisting," he shared. "Any advice?" For a moment, they had a real conversation, just two people sharing thoughts about service and duty. The first-class cabin was filling up now. A couple with matching wedding rings settled in a few rows behind him, and a woman in a smart business suit approached his row. She was well-dressed, probably in her 50s, with perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry. As she checked her ticket and realized she had a seat next to Michael, her expression changed dramatically. Michael could feel the shift in the air before anything was said. He'd seen that look before, the tightening of the lips, the slight step backward, the quick glance around for help. It was a look he'd hoped to avoid today, but here it was, as familiar as an old scar. The woman clutched her handbag tighter and immediately turned to flag down Linda, who was helping another passenger. Michael pretended to be absorbed in adjusting his seatbelt, giving her the privacy of her prejudice. He could hear his mother's voice in his head. "Their ignorance is their burden, not yours." Other passengers were starting to notice the scene developing. An older woman across the aisle lowered her magazine, watching with concern. Two businessmen paused their conversation. The couple behind them went quiet. It was like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Linda made her way over, professional smile still in place. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked, though everyone knew exactly what the problem was. The woman in the business suit lowered her voice, but in the quiet cabin, her words carried anyway. "I need to be moved to a different seat. I can't possibly sit here." Michael kept his eyes forward, his face calm. 3 tours of duty had taught him that sometimes the hardest battles were fought with patience and dignity, not weapons. He thought about all the men he'd served with. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian. How they'd all bled the same color, saved each other's lives without thinking about race. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. More passengers were boarding, having to squeeze past the woman who still stood in the aisle, creating a small traffic jam. Linda stayed professional but firm, checking her seating chart, although they all knew there was a reason this woman wanted to move, and it had nothing to do with the seat itself. Through the small window, Michael could see the ground crew finishing their work, preparing the plane for takeoff. Soon they'd all be together in the sky, whether they liked it or not. He straightened his shoulders slightly, neither apologetic nor confrontational. He'd earned his place here, paid for it with years of service, and he wasn't about to let anyone make him feel otherwise. The scene was building to a turning point, and everyone in first class knew it. What happened next would reveal not just one person's prejudice, but the character of everyone on that plane. The real question was, who would speak up first? The tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak as a woman's voice grew louder, abandoning her earlier attempts at discretion. "I simply won't sit here," she declared, her perfectly manicured hand gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You must understand my position. I paid good money for this seat." Michael remained still, his military training helping him maintain his composure. He'd faced enemy fire with less anxiety than he felt in this moment, but you wouldn't know it from his calm expression. His hands rested quietly in his lap, neither clenched nor trembling. The medals on his chest caught the cabin light, a silent testimony to his service. Linda, the flight attendant, tried her best to handle the situation diplomatically. "Ma'am, all of our first-class seats are assigned. The flight is fully booked." She kept her voice low and professional, though there was a slight tremor of frustration in it. "Perhaps if you could just take your seat, we can make sure you're comfortable with an extra pillow or—" Comfortable. The woman's laugh was sharp and bitter. "How can I possibly be comfortable? This is completely unacceptable." She gestured vaguely in Michael's direction without actually looking at him. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to be absorbed in their magazines or looking out windows, while others watched the scene unfold with growing concern. The line of passengers still trying to board was getting longer, creating a human traffic jam in the aisle. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, adding to the tension. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure time, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding in first class. Then something unexpected happened. An older gentleman in the row across from Michael slowly closed his newspaper and stood up. He was tall, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without asking for it. He wore a simple suit, but his bearing suggested authority. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And I feel compelled to share something with you, ma'am." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. This was taken in 1945, just after we liberated a small town in France. "See that young man next to me? He saved my life that day. He was a black soldier, just like this young man here." The cabin grew quiet enough to hear the distant sound of luggage being loaded below. The woman's expression flickered between embarrassment and defiance. The older man continued, "He threw himself on a grenade that would have killed our entire unit. Never asked about anybody's color when he did that. Never asked about color when we all bled together." Michael felt a lump in his throat, but maintained his composure. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up, let alone share such a powerful story. Other passengers began to stir, finding their voices. A young college student offered to switch seats with the woman. A businessman in row 3 loudly commented about how his best sales manager was a former black serviceman. The woman's face flushed red as she realized she was quickly becoming the villain in this story. She looked around for support but found none. Even those who had been pretending not to notice were now watching with obvious disapproval of her behavior. Linda stepped forward again, this time with more confidence. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that the doors are about to close. You have two choices. Take your assigned seat, or I can help you arrange for a different flight. But I should warn you that your luggage has already been loaded, and it would take some time to retrieve it." The weight of public opinion and the practicality of the situation seemed to finally hit home. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, her protest deflating in the face of united opposition. She glanced at her watch, then at her bag, clearly calculating her options. Time seemed to stand still as everyone waited for her decision. In that moment, Michael thought about how often change happens, not in grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in small moments like this, when ordinary people decide they've had enough of the old ways. Linda stood at the center of attention now, her role as flight attendant suddenly transformed into something much more significant. Her hands smoothed her uniform skirt. A nervous habit she developed over years of handling difficult situations. But this was different from the usual complaints about cold coffee or limited legroom. She looked between Michael, still sitting with quiet dignity in his uniform, and the woman who refused to take her seat. The other passengers waited, the air thick with anticipation. In her 15 years of flying, Linda had never faced a moment quite like this. The right decision was clear, but handling it properly would require both firmness and tact. "Ma'am," Linda began, keeping her voice steady, "I want to be very clear about our airline's policy. We do not discriminate against any passengers, and we certainly don't reassign seats based on—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. personal preferences about who you sit next to. The older gentleman who had shared his war story remained standing, his presence lending silent support to Linda's words. Other passengers began to murmur in agreement. A young woman in a flowered dress spoke up from row 4. "I'd be happy to trade seats with her if she's so uncomfortable. Though I think she'd be missing out on sitting next to a true American hero." The woman clutched her handbag tighter. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her growing discomfort. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm going to write to your supervisors about this treatment." Linda took a deep breath. Years of customer service experience had taught her how to handle difficult people, but this moment called for something more. This wasn't just about airline policy, it was about basic human dignity. "You're welcome to file a complaint," Linda replied calmly. "But right now, we have 3 options. You can take your assigned seat, except one of the kind offers to switch with another passenger, or I can help you deplane and rebook on a later flight. But we need to make this decision quickly. We're already running behind schedule." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, announcing final preparations for takeoff. The sound seemed to underscore the urgency of the situation. Other passengers were still stuck in the aisle, waiting to reach their seats in economy class. Michael remained silent through all of this, his eyes focused straight ahead. His military training had taught him how to face enemy fire, but it had also taught him when to let others fight their battles. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone on that plane choosing which side of history they wanted to stand on. A businessman in the front row cleared his throat. "You know, I run a company with over 200 employees. The best manager I ever hired was a former serviceman. Color didn't matter. His leadership did." Others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. What started as one woman's prejudice had transformed into a moment of collective conscience. People who might normally have stayed quiet were finding their voices, standing up for what was right. Linda felt the change too. Her nervousness about handling the situation faded, replaced by a quiet determination. She thought about her own father, who had fought in the war, and how he taught her that character was about doing the right thing, especially when it was difficult. Time was running out. The ground crew outside was finishing their final checks. Soon they would close the aircraft doors, and a decision would have to be made. Linda straightened her shoulders and prepared to take whatever action would be necessary. The woman looked around the cabin one last time, perhaps hoping to find some support, but found none. Instead, she saw faces filled with disappointment and disapproval. The weight of public opinion was crushing her previous confidence, leaving her with a decision that would reveal not just her choice, but her character. The older gentleman who had shared his war story wasn't finished. With the photo still in his hand, he took a step closer to the center of the aisle. There was something about his presence that commanded attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or perhaps it was the quiet authority in his voice. "I've been a judge for 35 years, he announced, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "And I've seen all kinds of injustice in my courtroom. But you know what gives me hope? Moments like this, when ordinary people stand up for what's right." His words seemed to give others courage. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes spoke up from her seat. "My brother served in the military too. He always said the bullets don't care what color you are." "Neither should we." Her voice trembled slightly, but her conviction was clear. Michael remained composed, though anyone looking closely might have noticed him grip the armrest a little tighter. He thought about all his fellow soldiers, how they'd shared meals, saved each other's lives, mourned their losses together. None of that had anything to do with the color of their skin. The judge wasn't done speaking. He turned to address the woman directly, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Ma'am, I was there when they raised the flag at Iwo Jima. I saw brave men of all colors fight and die for the freedom you're enjoying right now. The same freedom that allows this young sergeant to sit in first class. just like any other American who earned their seat. Linda watched as his words hit home. Other passengers nodded in agreement. A young couple who had been quiet until now exchanged glances before the husband spoke up. My grandfather always regretted staying silent during the civil rights protests. He taught me that silence in the face of prejudice is its own kind of wrong. The woman's perfectly maintained facade began to crack. Her hands fidgeted with her expensive bracelet as she looked around the cabin. Where she had expected to find support, or at least silent acceptance, she found only disapproval. The unified response of the passengers seemed to shake her confidence. A businessman in a neat suit who had been typing on his laptop closed it and cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "I travel every week for work. Sit next to all kinds of people. Found out the only thing that matters is character. And from what I can see, there's only one person showing poor character in this situation." The young college student who had offered to switch seats earlier stood up again. "Look at his medals," she said, pointing respectfully toward Michael's uniform. "Each one of those represents service to our country, to all of us, including you, ma'am." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What started as one woman's prejudice had become a moment of collective conscience. People who might never have spoken up before found themselves unable to stay silent. It wasn't just about one seat on one flight anymore. It was about the kind of world they wanted to live in. Michael finally turned his head slightly, meeting the judge's eyes. A look of understanding passed between them. Two men who had seen both the worst and the best of humanity. The older man gave him a slight nod, a gesture of respect between soldiers that transcended generations. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with more urgency. "Flight crew, prepare for immediate departure." The sound seemed to snap everyone back to the immediate situation at hand. They were still on a plane that needed to take off, and a decision had to be made. Linda stepped forward one last time, her voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, we need your final decision now. Will you be taking your seat, accepting another passenger's offer to switch, or would you like me to help you deplane?" The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the woman's response. This was more than a choice about where to sit. It was a moment that would reveal character, that would show whether old prejudices could give way to new understanding. Faced with the mounting pressure of public opinion and the ticking clock of departure time, the woman's composure finally crumbled. She looked around one last time, perhaps hoping for a last-minute escape, but found only firm, disapproving faces staring back at her. "This is absolutely outrageous," she muttered, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to wilt slightly as she reached up to touch it nervously. "I've never been treated like this in my life. I'm a loyal customer. I fly first class twice a month." From somewhere in the back of the plane, a voice called out, "What's the holdup?" The line of passengers still trying to reach their seats in economy had grown longer. The delay was affecting everyone now, and patience was wearing thin. The young college student who had offered to switch seats stood up again. "Ma'am, my offer still stands. I'd be honored to sit next to a soldier who served our country." Her sincerity was obvious, but there was also a gentle rebuke in her words that everyone could hear. Linda glanced at her watch, then at the cockpit door. The captain would be expecting an all-clear signal soon. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "we really need your decision now. The entire flight is being delayed." The businessman who had spoken earlier closed his laptop completely and leaned forward. "You know what's really interesting?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was just reading about how the military was actually ahead of the rest of society in integration. They figured out before anyone else that what matters is ability, not color." Michael remained dignified and silent, but his eyes flickered briefly to the photo of his mother in his breast pocket. He thought about what she would say if she could see this moment, probably something about how change happens one person at a time, one moment at a time. The judge, still standing nearby, pulled out his business card. "I'd be happy to receive any formal complaints about today's flight," he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "I'm sure the airline's lawyers would find my observations about this incident very interesting." A flight attendant from economy class appeared, looking concerned about the delay. She whispered something to Linda, who nodded gravely. The situation had now escalated beyond a simple seating dispute. It was affecting the entire plane's schedule. The woman's face flushed red as she realized she had become the villain in this impromptu drama. Her expensive makeup couldn't hide her discomfort as she looked at her watch for the 10th time. Her flight schedule, her luggage, her carefully planned business trip. Everything was at risk now. From the back of the plane, more voices joined the chorus of frustration. "What's going on out there? We're going to miss our connection." The pressure was building from all sides. The older couple sitting across the aisle exchanged knowing looks. The wife spoke up, her voice gentle but clear. "You know, dear, sometimes life gives us chances to be better than we thought we could be. This might be one of those moments for you." Linda stepped forward one final time, her patience evident but clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that if we don't resolve this immediately, we'll have to contact ground operations. That would mean even more delays, and possibly police involvement." The word police seemed to hang in the air. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The situation had reached a critical point, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just about one woman's prejudice anymore. It was about an entire plane full of people taking a stand. Michael straightened his uniform jacket slightly, a small gesture that drew attention to his medals once again. Each one told a story of service, of sacrifice, of a commitment to something larger than himself. The contrast between his quiet dignity and the woman's increasingly frustrated behavior couldn't have been clearer. The tension finally broke when the woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I'll get off the plane. I simply cannot and will not sit here." Linda nodded professionally, though there was a hint of relief in her expression. "I'll help you gather your things and escort you to the gate. We'll need to arrange for your luggage to be removed from the cargo hold." As the woman prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. The young college student who had offered to switch seats earlier spoke up again. "Wait," she said, her voice clear and kind. "Before you make this choice, maybe think about what you'll tell people when they ask why you missed your flight." The businessman added quietly, "Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing." His words seemed to hover in the air, heavy with meaning. The woman paused, her hand clutching the back of an empty seat. For the first time since the incident began, she actually looked at Michael, really looked at him. She saw his pressed uniform, the medals that spoke of courage and sacrifice, the quiet dignity in his posture. Perhaps she also saw something of her own prejudices reflected back at her. The judge, who had been watching carefully, spoke again. "You know, in my years on the bench, I've seen many people face moments of choice. The ones who chose to grow, to learn, to be better. They're the ones who could look themselves in the mirror the next morning." A flight attendant appeared with a clipboard, ready to begin the paperwork for deplaning a passenger. The sound of her approaching footsteps seemed to echo in the quiet cabin. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the woman's expression began to change. The anger and indignation slowly melted into something else, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps realization, or maybe just exhaustion from fighting a battle she now knew she couldn't win. She started, then stopped. Swallowed hard. Started again. "I suppose I could. Stay." The words seemed to cost her something to say, but they came out nonetheless. "But I want it noted that I'm doing this under protest." Linda diplomatically pretended not to hear the last part. "Thank you for your decision, ma'am. Please take your seat so we can prepare for departure." The woman slowly, stiffly lowered herself into her assigned seat next to Michael. Her movements were rigid, her face set in a mask of discomfort, but she was staying. It wasn't a graceful surrender, but it was a surrender nonetheless. Michael, who had remained admirably composed throughout the entire ordeal, simply nodded politely as she sat down. He didn't gloat, didn't comment, didn't do anything to make the situation more difficult. His dignity in that moment spoke volumes. The rest of the first-class cabin seemed to collectively exhale. The young college student smiled warmly. The judge nodded in approval before returning to his seat. The businessman reopened his laptop. Slowly, the normal sounds of pre-flight preparation resumed. Linda moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead compartments, helping the flight return to its normal routine. But everyone knew they had just witnessed something significant, a small battle in a much larger war for human dignity and respect. As the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, the woman sat stiffly in her seat, staring straight ahead. Michael pulled out a book from his carry-on, his movements careful and measured, creating as little disturbance as possible. The physical distance between them was inches, but the emotional distance seemed like miles. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The initial drama had passed, but its effects lingered in the air like static before a storm. Michael kept his attention on his book, though anyone watching closely might have noticed he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. The woman beside him maintained her rigid posture, hands folded tightly in her lap. When Linda came by with the drink service, her thank you was barely audible. She accepted her glass of white wine with trembling fingers, some of the expensive jewelry on her wrist catching the cabin light. Gradually, something remarkable began to happen. Other passengers started making their way up the aisle, one by one, ostensibly to use the first-class restroom. Each one would pause briefly by Michael's seat. A middle-aged teacher smiled warmly and whispered, "Thank you for your service." A businessman in his 60s gave a respectful nod. A young mother holding a sleeping baby mouthed a silent "thank you." The judge, who had been such a powerful voice earlier, watched this quiet parade with approval. He caught Michael's eye and raised his water glass in a civil salute. The gesture spoke volumes about respect and solidarity. The woman couldn't help but notice the steady stream of support. Each thank you, each smile, each gesture of respect seemed to chip away at her earlier certainty. Her shoulders gradually began to lose some of their stiffness. The tight grip on her wine glass loosened slightly. About 2 hours into the flight, turbulence struck. The plane bounced and shuddered, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to grip their armrests. Without thinking, the woman grabbed the nearest solid object, which happened to be Michael's arm. When she realized what she'd done, she quickly pulled back, but something had changed. That brief moment of shared human experience had cracked the ice. Michael simply smiled kindly and said, "It's okay, ma'am. These bumps can be scary, but I've flown through much worse." His voice was warm and gentle, without a trace of resentment for her earlier behavior. The woman stared at him for a moment, then looked down at her hands. I suppose you have," she said quietly. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the first real acknowledgement of him as a person rather than just an unwanted seatmate. Linda, passing by with the meal service, noticed the slight thaw. She took extra care with both their dinner trays, her professional smile a bit warmer now. "Our chef prepared a special meal for our service members today," she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Thank you again for your service, Sergeant." As they ate their meals, the woman snuck glances at Michael's medals. Finally, curiosity overcame prejudice. "That one," she said hesitantly, pointing to a particular medal. "What is it for?" Michael looked down at his chest, his expression thoughtful. "That one? I got it for leading an evacuation mission. We helped get 35 children out of a village under fire." He spoke matter-of-factly, without boasting or drama. The woman's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Children?" she repeated softly. For the first time, something like real emotion crossed her face. "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied. "When you're out there, you don't think about anything except doing what's right. Those kids needed help, so we helped them. Simple as that." Other passengers pretended not to listen, but they were all ears. The young college student smiled behind her magazine. The judge nodded slowly, understanding the power of this quiet moment of connection. The woman dabbed at her mouth with her napkin, seeming to gather her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, more uncertain. I have grandchildren," she said, almost to herself. "I can't imagine." Michael nodded understandingly. "Would you like to see a picture of the kids we saved?" he asked, reaching for his wallet. "I keep it as a reminder of why we do what we do." As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the first-class cabin felt different from how it had started. The tension that had filled the air hours ago had transformed into something else, not quite comfort, but understanding. Michael carefully tucked away the photographs he'd been showing, including the one of the children he'd helped save. The woman sat quietly, her eyes slightly red. Whether from fatigue or emotion, it was hard to tell. She had listened to his stories without interruption, asked questions about his service, and even shared a few stories about her own grandchildren. Her designer handbag, which she had clutched so tightly earlier, now lay forgotten at her feet. The judge, who had watched this transformation from across the aisle, caught Linda's eye and smiled knowingly. Sometimes the biggest changes happened in the smallest moments, in the quiet spaces between takeoff and landing. As they descended through the clouds, the woman finally spoke the words that had been building for hours. I believe I owe you an apology," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "My behavior earlier was, well, it was unacceptable." Michael turned to her with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the flight. "Ma'am," he replied gently, "sometimes the hardest battles we fight are with ourselves. I've learned that victory isn't always about who's right or wrong. It's about moving forward together." The young college student, who had offered to switch seats hours ago, wiped away a tear. The businessman nearby pretended to be very interested in his laptop screen, but he was clearly listening. Even Linda slowed her preparation for landing to witness this moment. "My generation," the woman continued, her voice stronger now, "we were taught certain things. But sitting here, listening to your stories, seeing those pictures," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "Well, maybe it's time I learned some new things." The plane touched down smoothly, the slight bump causing everyone to shift in their seats. As they taxied to the gate, the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "My husband and I," she said, "we support several children's charities. Perhaps you could tell me more about those children you helped. Maybe there's something we could do." Michael accepted the card with a warm smile. "That would be wonderful, ma'am. Those kids still need all the help they can get." As passengers began to gather their belongings, something remarkable happened. The judge stood up and started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, the college student, the businessman, the young mother, until the entire first-class cabin filled with applause. They weren't just clapping for Michael's service. They were celebrating something larger, a small moment of change, a tiny victory in the ongoing battle for human dignity. Linda watched from the front of the cabin, her eyes bright with tears. In all her years of flying, she'd seen countless dramas unfold in these seats, but few had ended quite like this. As they prepared to deplane, the woman touched Michael's arm lightly. "Thank you," she said, "not just for your service to our country, but for your patience today. You taught me more in this flight than I've learned in years." Michael could see his sister waiting at the gate through the plane's window, holding a welcome home sign just as she promised. But before heading toward her, he turned back to the woman. "Thank you, ma'am, for being willing to learn. That takes its own kind of courage." The judge, gathering his belongings, leaned over and whispered to Linda, Make sure this gets into the airline's records. Some stories need to be remembered. As passengers filed out of the plane, each one nodding respectfully to Michael, it was clear that this flight had been more than just a journey from Atlanta to San Francisco. It had been a journey of transformation, a reminder that change is possible, even at 30,000 feet.